They sent a geologist to stop a war that had not yet begun, and when the earth itself became the weapon, they locked her in a closet to die. They did not know that the rock spoke to her in a language of fractures and stress, that silence was a canvas on which she painted equations of force, and that the woman they saw as a meek scientist was, in fact, the deadliest thing in the deep. They tried to bury her under a mountain, forgetting she was the one who knew its secrets. 5 minutes later, she walked out, and the world held its breath for the reckoning she was about to deliver. The silence inside Cerberus Deep was a physical entity. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of immense, soul-crushing pressure. 3 miles of igneous and metamorphic rock pressed down on the reinforced titanium carbide shell of the listening post, a weight so profound it seemed to leach noise from the air. The recycled atmosphere hummed with the low, monotonic drone of life support and the ghostly whisper of the server farms, a sound one felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. It was a cold, sterile environment, smelling of ozone, chilled metal, and the faint mineral tang of weeping rock from beyond the containment walls. The light was a constant, shadowless pale blue, emitted by LED strips that ran the length of the corridors, designed to mimic a pre-dawn sky that the 40 souls stationed here would not see for another 6 months. Dr. Alara Vance felt the station's unique resonance as a constant, low-frequency thrum against her teeth. To the others, it was background noise, a part of the oppressive sensory deprivation of the deep. To her, it was a baseline, a 0 point against which all other vibrations were measured. She sat not at the main command console, but at a secondary station tucked into an alcove carved directly from the native granite. Her terminal was a custom rig, patched into the station's primary sensor grid, but routed through her own proprietary analysis software. The screens before her were not filled with the crisp, tactical readouts of the naval crew, but with chaotic, cascading waveforms, fractal patterns of lithospheric data, and complex Fourier transforms that mapped the deep Earth's subtle groans. Her fingers moved with quiet economy across the keyboard, her focus absolute. She was a small woman, easily overlooked, dressed in simple gray fatigues that bore no rank or insignia. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, pale from the lack of sun, was a mask of placid concentration. She looked like a technician, a geological surveyor, a civilian contractor utterly out of place among the hardened naval personnel who operated the most secret listening post on the planet. Her current task was the calibration of the station's outermost geophone network, a spiderweb of thousands of piezoelectric sensors drilled deep into the surrounding rock, extending for miles in every direction. They were designed to detect the faintest tectonic shifts, the whisper of magma moving in the mantle, the precursors to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. That was their official purpose. Their true purpose was far more sensitive. Alara was not listening for the planet's natural movements. She was listening for anomalies. She was hunting for a ghost, a signal so faint it was indistinguishable from the background noise of a living world. Her fingers coaxed a new algorithm into life, a recursive filter designed to isolate non-stochastic resonance patterns. The waterfall display on her central monitor shimmered, the chaotic noise resolving into a slightly more ordered, yet still unintelligible, pattern. A frown, so slight it was barely a tremor, touched her lips. It was there, a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the stone. The main hatch to the command center hissed open, a violent slash of sound that broke the carefully maintained equilibrium. Commander Thorne entered the room, as if he were invading it. He was a large man, built like a battering ram, his chest puffed out with the self-importance that came from a career spent in the rigid hierarchy of the Navy. His uniform was immaculate, his boots striking the grated floor with loud, proprietary clicks that echoed in the pressurized silence. He radiated a field of nervous energy, a constant need for affirmation and control that was antithetical to the station's deep, quiet purpose. His eyes, small and restless, swept the command center, not observing, but inspecting for flaws, for any deviation from his rigid worldview. "Report," he boomed, his voice a blunt instrument in the delicate acoustic environment. Lieutenant Jaskowski, the watch officer, snapped to attention from his seat at the main console. "All systems green, Commander. Atmospheric pressure stable at 1.2 bars. Power core operating at 98% efficiency. No seismic anomalies detected on standard channels." Jaskowski's voice was tight, disciplined. Thorne grunted, a sound of profound dissatisfaction. A green board was a board he couldn't micromanage. His gaze continued its sweep and finally landed on the alcove, on the small, quiet woman who had not looked up from her work. His eyes narrowed. He strode over to her station, his bulk casting a large shadow over her screens. Alara did not acknowledge him. She continued her work, her focus a shield against his intrusion. She was tracing the faint signal, a patterned vibration at 1.224 hertz, a frequency that should not exist in nature. It was too perfect, too rhythmic. It was a heartbeat where there should be none. "Dr. Vance," Thorne said, his voice laced with a patronizing condescension he reserved for civilians and junior officers. "Are we still chasing subterranean butterflies? Or have you found a reason to be drawing a paycheck today?" Alara finished the line of code she was writing before she looked up. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they met his without fear or deference. They were the eyes of an analyst, assessing a data point. "The lithosphere isn't a homogeneous medium, Commander," she stated, her voice soft, but carrying a strange weight, a density that seemed to absorb the room's ambient hum. "The propagation of shear waves through the granite gneiss boundary below us creates inherent harmonic distortions. I'm filtering for them." Thorne stared at her blankly. He understood perhaps one word in 5. Her explanation was not for him. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same clinical detachment she would use to describe the mineral composition of a rock sample. This lack of deference, this quiet refusal to be intimidated by his rank, was a constant source of irritation for him. He saw her not as a specialist, but as an academic indulgence foisted upon his command by some out-of-touch admiral in Pearl Harbor. "Filter for this, Doctor," he sneered, leaning closer, invading her personal space. "This is a naval installation, a military command, not a university laboratory. Your research is a secondary concern. My primary concern is operational readiness. Do you see anything on your screen that threatens my operational readiness?" He gestured dismissively at her cascading waveforms. Alara's gaze dropped back to her central monitor. The 1.224 hertz signal was still there, a faint, insistent pulse. It was nested inside a carrier wave of much lower frequency, camouflaged by the Earth's own resonance. It was impossibly sophisticated. It was a whisper that could level a mountain. "Yes," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Thorne blinked. It was not the answer he expected. He was prepared for a placating, "No, sir," or more incomprehensible jargon. The simple, direct affirmative caught him off guard. What do you see?" "A pattern," she replied, her eyes tracing the signal's path, through layers of simulated strata. It's artificial, structured, and it's learning. He stared at her, then let out a short, barking laugh. The sound was ugly in the quiet room. Learning? Doctor, you've been underground too long. You're seeing ghosts in the static. The rocks are not learning. He straightened up, his authority reasserting itself. Let me be clear. Unless you see a torpedo in the water or a missile in the air, you report to Lieutenant Jaskowski. You do not distract my command staff with geological poetry. Is that understood? Before Alara could respond, a low, resonant thrum echoed through the station. It was not the familiar groan of the earth settling. This was different. It was deeper, more focused. The metal plates of the floor vibrated, a single, powerful oscillation that lasted for 3 seconds and then vanished. On the main tactical display, a dozen minor systems flickered from green to yellow. What was that? Thorne demanded, whirling to face the main console. Jaskowski's fingers flew across his own keyboard. Unidentified seismic event, sir. Low magnitude, but focused. Origin point is unclear. It seems to have come from everywhere at once. Run a diagnostic, Thorne barked. Check for system damage. Full spectrum scan, now. Alara ignored the commands being shouted behind her. Her eyes were locked on her screen. The 1.224 hertz signal had spiked, perfectly synchronized with the vibration. And then it had vanished. Not faded. Vanished. As if a switch had been thrown. The artificial heartbeat was gone, but something else was there in its place. A new frequency, subtler, quieter. It was listening. The first pulse had been a query. It had pinged the station, testing its structural resonance, its power grid, its electronic defenses. The silence that followed was the enemy processing the data. It was a query, she said, speaking to herself more than to anyone else. Thorne overheard her. A what? What are you mumbling about now, Vance? That wasn't a random event, she said, turning in her chair to face him. Her expression was no longer placid. It was sharp, focused, like a lens snapping into clarity. That was a targeted resonance pulse. It mapped us. The next one won't be a test. Thorne's face darkened with fury. Her calm, factual statement in the face of his frantic commands was a direct challenge to his authority. He saw it as an attempt to usurp control, to sow panic using her academic nonsense. He strode back to her alcove, his face inches from hers. I am in command of this station, Doctor, he hissed, his voice low and menacing, and I am ordering you to stand down. You are a civilian. You will not create panic with your wild theories. Power down your terminal. Commander, you don't understand, Alara said, her tone level, devoid of emotion. This is a new form of warfare. They're using the planet's crust as a transmission medium. They're not attacking the station. They're attacking the rock it's built in. They're trying to find our resonant frequency. When they find it, they will shatter this entire mountain. Her words hung in the air, a prophecy of unimaginable violence. For a moment, even Thorne was silenced by the sheer audacity of the concept. Lieutenant Jaskowski looked over from his console, his face pale, a flicker of understanding and fear in his eyes. He had seen the energy readings. They didn't make sense. They weren't like any earthquake he had ever studied at the academy. They were too clean, too precise. Thorne recovered quickly, his ego reasserting itself over the cold prickle of fear. That's enough, he roared, his voice cracking the tense atmosphere. I will not have this insubordination. Petty Officer Davies, Petty Officer Cole, escort Dr. Vance to her quarters. She is to be confined until further notice. For her own safety, he added, the words a thin veneer over his true intention. To silence her, to remove the dissenting data point that was his own inadequacy. Two burly petty officers, Davies and Cole, approached hesitantly. They were crewmen, electricians, and mechanics, not guards. Davies, a young man with intelligent eyes, glanced from Thorne's furious face to Alara's unnervingly calm one. He had spent the last 2 months working near her, occasionally helping her rig a power conduit or a data line. He had seen the way she worked. He didn't understand it, but he recognized a level of focus and expertise that bordered on inhuman. He did not want to do this. "Sir," Davies began, a note of question in his voice. "That was an order, petty officer," Thorne bellowed. Alara stood up slowly. She did not look at the 2 men flanking her. She looked directly at Thorne. "You're making a mistake, Commander," she said simply. It was not a threat. It was a diagnosis. The only mistake was allowing a civilian academic to run wild in a military facility, Thorne shot back. "Get her out of my command center." Davies and Cole exchanged a look. Cole, the larger of the two, placed a hand gently on Alara's arm. "Ma'am, please," he said, his voice respectful. Alara did not resist. She allowed them to lead her out of the command center. As they walked down the sterile blue corridor, the silence seemed to deepen once more. But now it was not the silence of pressure. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence of a clock ticking down to 0. Thorne, watching her go, felt a surge of triumph. He had restored order. He had eliminated the variable. He turned back to his command center, a king surveying his domain, utterly blind to the fact that he had just locked the only person who could save them in a cage, while the executioner sharpened its axe. The 2 petty officers did not take her to her quarters. Thorne's order had been vague, and her small bunk was on the other side of the habitat module. Instead, they took a turn down a maintenance corridor, the blue light giving way to a harsher, yellow industrial glow. The air here was colder, smelling of grease and charged ions. They stopped in front of a heavy steel door marked Server Room 3B, restricted access. "Commander's orders, ma'am," Cole said, his voice apologetic. "He said to secure you somewhere out of the way." Davies looked uncomfortable. "It's just a server maintenance closet, ma'am. We'll be right outside." The room was not a closet. It was a small, cramped space, a Faraday cage designed to house auxiliary network servers. It was filled with humming racks of processors and power supplies, leaving only a narrow aisle down the middle. It was windowless, soundproofed, and the air was thick with the heat from the machinery. The door was a heavy, electromagnetically sealed blast door. Alara stepped inside without a word. She surveyed the room in a single, sweeping glance. The humming racks, the bundled fiber optic cables, the power distribution unit on the far wall, the lock mechanism on the door jamb. She turned and looked at Davies. "The next pulse will come in less than 10 minutes, she said, her voice flat. "It will target the primary coolant lines for the power core. The resulting overload will cascade through the entire power grid. The emergency batteries won't have time to engage before the life support systems fail." Davies's eyes widened. He knew the station's engineering schematics by heart. A failure in the primary coolant lines was his worst nightmare. It was the one scenario from which there was no easy recovery. "How do you know that?" he whispered. "They're not trying to shake us apart piece by piece," she explained patiently, as if to a student. "That's inefficient. They're looking for a single point of failure." The first pulse identified the power grid as a complex, high-energy system. The coolant lines are its most vulnerable component, It's the most logical next step. Cole shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, we have our orders. He pulled the heavy door shut. There was a solid thump, followed by the distinct, high-pitched whine of the magnetic lock engaging. A red light blinked on above the doorframe. She was sealed in. Inside the server room, the hum of the machines was a deafening roar. The heat was already oppressive. For anyone else, it would be a tomb. A claustrophobic, suffocating prison. Alara felt the vibrations of the servers through the soles of her boots. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in despair, but in concentration. She cataloged the sounds, the frequencies, the 60 hertz hum of the power supplies, the higher-pitched whine of the cooling fans, the subtle crackle of data moving through silicon. She placed her palm flat against the metal door. It was cold and utterly solid. She could feel the faint electromagnetic field of the lock. 5 minutes. That was the window she had given them. In reality, she calculated it was closer to 4. The enemy was efficient. There was no time for anger, no time for panic. There was only the problem and the solution. Her eyes scanned the room again, this time not as a prisoner, but as a predator assessing its environment. Her gaze fell upon a coil of discarded Cat6 Ethernet cable on a shelf and a diagnostic toolkit left open by a careless technician. Inside it, among other tools, was a wire stripper and a small handheld digital multimeter. Perfect. She moved with a fluid, deliberate grace. She took the multimeter and a length of the Ethernet cable. With the wire stripper, she quickly stripped the plastic sheathing from both ends of a 2-foot section, exposing the 8 thin, color-coded copper wires within. She then turned her attention to the door's control panel. It was a standard naval security interface, a small keypad, currently deactivated, and an emergency manual release shielded by a locked metal plate. Breaking the plate was not an option. It would take too long and make too much noise. The lock was electronic, and all electronics had a vulnerability. She knelt and examined the conduit running from the wall into the door frame, carrying power and data to the lock mechanism. Using the edge of the multimeter's case, she found the seam in the conduit's housing and pried it open, exposing the bundled wires inside. Red for power, black for ground, green and white for data. Standard military spec. The lock was held in place by a powerful electromagnet, which required a constant flow of electricity to remain engaged. The failsafe in a power outage was a secondary, capacitor-driven circuit that would hold the lock for 60 seconds before releasing. To open the door, she didn't need to break the lock. She just needed to convince it that the power had failed. Her plan was simple, elegant, and dangerous. She couldn't just cut the power wire. That would trigger a silent alarm in the command center. She needed to create a controlled short circuit, one that would trip the local breaker for this specific circuit without alerting the station's central monitoring system. It had to be precise. Too little power, and it wouldn't trip the breaker. Too much, and she could fuse the entire panel, or worse, electrocute herself. She took 2 of the thin copper wires she had stripped from the Ethernet cable. Using the multimeter, she tested the voltage from the main power line. 24 volts DC, high but manageable. She calculated the resistance of the copper wire in her head. She knew the approximate amperage of the circuit from the gauge of the power lines. She knew the trip point of standard naval breakers. The equation resolved in her mind in less than a second. Now. With a surgeon's precision, she took the 2 thin copper strands and touched them for a fraction of a second to the exposed terminals of the red and black wires. There was a bright blue spark, a sharp crack like a whip, and the deafening roar of the servers abruptly died. The oppressive heat remained, but the room was plunged into a shocking, absolute silence and darkness. She had tripped the breaker. The main power was cut. A single tiny emergency LED on the power distribution unit flickered on, casting a feeble red glow. On the door, the red locked light was out. She could hear the faint high-frequency whine of the lock's capacitor, bleeding its stored energy. 60 seconds. She didn't wait. She grabbed the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The electromagnet was still partially energized. She needed leverage. Her eyes darted around the dark room, illuminated only by the faint red glow. She saw the metal shelf the toolkit had been on. With a grunt of effort, she ripped it from its brackets. It was a 2-foot length of steel. She jammed one end into the space between the door and the frame, right next to the lock mechanism. 50 seconds. She put her shoulder against the door and her full weight onto the steel bar, using it as a lever. The metal groaned in protest. Her muscles screamed from the strain. She was not a large woman, but every ounce of her was dense, conditioned muscle. She was a weapon, forged in the brutal crucible of SEAL training, honed by 1,000 impossible challenges. Her mind was her primary tool, but her body was a finely tuned instrument. 40 seconds. The capacitor's whine was fading. The magnetic field was weakening. She gave one final, desperate heave. There was a loud clank as the last of the magnetic force gave way, and the locking bolt scraped back. The door swung inward a few inches. Silence. She stepped back, breathing heavily, the steel bar clattering to the floor. She took a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs, and centered herself. She smoothed down her fatigues, pushed a stray strand of hair back into place, and composed her features into a mask of calm neutrality. Then she pulled the heavy door open and walked out into the yellow-lit maintenance corridor. Davies and Cole were standing there, their backs to her, facing down the corridor toward the command center. They were arguing in hushed, frantic tones. "It's been almost 10 minutes, Davies was saying, his voice tight with anxiety. "Something's wrong. The lights are flickering. Can't you feel that?" "Thorne will have our stripes if we leave this post," Cole retorted, though his voice lacked conviction. "He said to wait." "Wait for what? To die?" "I'm not waiting," a calm voice said behind them. The two men spun around. Their faces were a mixture of shock, disbelief, and sheer, unadulterated terror. Alara was standing there, unharmed, looking as if she had just stepped out for a casual stroll. The heavy, magnetically sealed door was open behind her. The red locked light was dark. "How?" Cole stammered, his mouth agape. "How did you—" Alara ignored him. Her attention was on a low, almost subsonic vibration that was beginning to build in the floor plates. It was the enemy's second pulse. She was almost out of time. "Davies," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through his shock. "You know the engineering schematics better than anyone. I need to bypass the central power regulation console and create a direct, unfiltered feed from the secondary capacitor banks to the seismology array." "Can you do it?" Davies stared at her, his mind struggling to process the impossible fact of her presence. She had just defeated a military-grade blast door in minutes using nothing. He looked at the open door, then back at her calm, intense face. The fear on his face was slowly replaced by a dawning awe. The station was dying. The commander was useless. And this woman, this quiet, unassuming scientist, was giving orders that, while insane, sounded like an actual plan. He saw the truth in that moment. He had been guarding a prisoner. He should have been taking her orders. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the ma'am coming out instinctively, a recognition of a higher authority than rank. It would mean bypassing every safety protocol. If we get it wrong, we could fry the entire sensor grid. "We won't get it wrong," Alara said. It was a statement of absolute certainty. "Let's go." She started moving down the corridor toward the command center, not running, but walking with a swift, purposeful stride. Davies hesitated for only a second before falling into step beside her. Cole, his mind still reeling, watched them go for a moment, then scrambled to follow. They were no longer his prisoners. He was her army. As they reached the main corridor, the second pulse hit. It was not a thrum this time. It was a violent, wrenching lurch. The entire station groaned, the sound of 1,000 tons of metal and rock screaming in agony. The lights flickered wildly and then went out, plunging the corridor into absolute darkness, replaced a second later by the stark, terrifying red of the emergency lighting. Alarms blared, a cacophony of different tones signaling multiple, catastrophic failures. "Coolant lines for sectors Gamma and Delta are offline," a voice screamed over the intercom. "We have a pressure breach in Habitat Module 2. Core temperature is rising." Alara's prediction had been perfect. She didn't break her stride. She moved through the chaos as if it were a gentle breeze, her mind already 3 steps ahead. When they burst back into the command center, the scene was one of utter pandemonium. The main screens were a mess of red alerts and static-filled displays. Sparks showered from a ruptured conduit near the ceiling. Crew members were shouting, some trying to follow protocols that were no longer relevant, others frozen in fear. Commander Thorne was standing in the middle of it all, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He was yelling orders, but they were reflexive, useless commands. "Get me damage control, reroute power, somebody answer that alarm." His authority had evaporated. He was just a terrified man in a uniform, watching his world fall apart. His eyes fell on Alara, and for a moment his fear was replaced by a flash of pure, uncomprehending rage. "You!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "I gave you an order. I had you confined." Alara walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture. She went straight to the now vacant seismology station in the alcove. The screens were dark. The local power had been cut. "Davies," she said, her voice cutting through the din like a laser. "Power, now." Davies, his face set with grim determination, was already at a secondary engineering panel, his hands flying across the controls. He bypassed relays, rerouted circuits, his actions a blur of practiced expertise now guided by a clear, singular purpose. "Bypassing main bus, rerouting secondary capacitors. It's going to be a rough surge, ma'am," he yelled. "Just do it," Alara commanded. Thorne watched, dumbfounded, as one of his own men followed the orders of the woman he had just imprisoned. "Davies, what are you doing? I am your commanding officer. I order you to stop." Davies didn't even look at him. He slammed a large, shielded switch down. "Engaging!" With a loud hum, Alara's station flared back to life. The screens flickered, then stabilized, showing the familiar cascade of waveforms. But now the signal was no longer a faint whisper. It was a screaming, roaring monster. The enemy was no longer hiding. It was broadcasting on a wide band, a brute force assault of seismic energy. A new countdown clock had appeared on the main tactical display, generated by the station's own failing diagnostic systems. Structural integrity failure. Imminent, 120 seconds. The next pulse would be the kill shot. Ilara's fingers danced across her keyboard. Her face was a study in absolute concentration. The noise, the alarms, the shouting, it all faded away. There was only her, the data, and the impending deadline. The enemy was using a complex, multi-layered carrier wave, modulating the frequency to match the resonant properties of the surrounding rock. It was a symphony of destruction, and she was the only one who could read the sheet music. "They're targeting the primary compression arch above the station," she said, her voice calm and analytical. "It's a keynote. If it fractures, the entire mountain will collapse on top of us." Jaskowski, his face bleeding from a cut on his forehead, looked over from his console. "Can we counter it? Generate a counter frequency?" "No," Ilara said, without looking up. "We can't block it. The energy levels are too high. It would be like trying to stop a tidal wave with a sheet of paper. We aren't going to block it." She paused, her fingers keying in a rapid series of commands, rewriting the core programming of the seismology array's emitters. "We're going to send it back." A silence fell over the immediate area around her. Even the panicked crew members paused, their attention drawn to the impossible calm of the woman at the center of the storm. Thorne stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently, no words coming out. "Send it back?" Jaskowski asked, confused. "Resonant feedback," Ilara explained, her eyes never leaving the screen. "They are using the rock to transmit energy. They have created a closed loop between their transmitter and this station. They're pouring energy into that loop, waiting for the feedback to amplify to the point of structural failure. It's an elegant design." A flicker of something that might have been professional respect crossed her face. But they made a mistake. They assumed the transmission medium, the rock itself, is a perfect conductor. It isn't. She pointed to a small, almost invisible sine wave on one of her displays, a tiny imperfection in the massive wave of the enemy's attack. There, a harmonic artifact, caused by a large deposit of quartz monzonite 6 kilometers east of here. It's creating a slight phase distortion in the carrier wave, a tiny echo. They've been filtering it out, treating it as noise. Her fingers flew faster. She was no longer just analyzing. She was building. She was writing a new algorithm from scratch, a weapon made of pure mathematics. "We are not going to send their signal back," she clarified, a grim finality in her tone. "We are going to send their signal back, amplified by every emitter we have, and perfectly in phase with that harmonic echo. We're not just going to break the loop, we're going to reverse it. All the energy they're pumping into this mountain, it's going to go straight back to the source." The sheer, terrifying genius of it was breathtaking. She was going to use the planet itself as a focusing lens, turning the enemy's weapon against them with pinpoint accuracy. "Davies," she commanded, "I need you to synchronize the emitters. I'm uploading the firing solution now. Timing has to be perfect. We have to release our pulse at the exact peak of their carrier wave. Too soon, and we'll just add to the destruction. Too late, and we won't exist." "Synchronizing emitters," Davies confirmed, his voice steady. He was no longer a technician. He was her weapon system. "Firing solution received. Ma'am, the energy requirement it's off the scale. It will drain every capacitor and battery in the station. We'll be completely dark for at least a minute afterwards." "A minute of darkness is better than an eternity of it," Ilara said. On the main screen, the countdown clock read 45 seconds. Thorne finally found his voice. It was a weak, reedy thing. "You can't do that. It's unauthorized. It will destroy the station." Alara turned her head and looked at him. It was the first time she had truly looked at him since she re-entered the room. Her pale gray eyes were like chips of ice. "The station is already destroyed, Commander," she said, her voice utterly flat. "The only question is whether we die with it." She turned back to her screen. "Jaskowski, give me a countdown." Jaskowski looked at Thorne, who stood defeated and irrelevant. Then he looked at Alara, who held the fate of all of them in her hands. He made his choice. 30 seconds to enemy pulse peak, he announced, his voice ringing with newfound purpose. The entire station was vibrating now, a deep, bone-jarring shudder that grew with every passing second. Dust and small bits of rock rained down from the ceiling. The mountain was beginning to break apart. "Emitters synchronized," Davies reported, sweat beading on his forehead. "Board is green. We are go on your command, ma'am." 20 seconds, Jaskowski called out. Alara's hands went still. The algorithm was complete. The weapon was forged. Now, there was nothing to do but wait for the precise moment, the single heartbeat in time where salvation or annihilation lay. The command center was quiet now, the shouting replaced by a tense, prayerful silence. Every eye was on her. 10, 9, 8. The vibration intensified, the sound a rising, deafening scream of tortured rock and metal. 7, 6, 5. Alara placed her finger over the enter key. Her face was serene. 4, 3, 2. Her eyes were on the waveform, watching the massive peak of the enemy's signal surge toward its apex. 1, now. "Execute," she said, her voice a calm whisper in the roaring chaos. She pressed the key. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, every light in the station, from the main command screens to the red emergency strips, went out. They were plunged into a total, disorienting blackness, a colossal, silent wave of energy, invisible and unheard, erupted from Cerberus deep, a focused spear of pure resonance screaming through miles of solid rock. And then came the recoil. The station was thrown sideways by a force that had no right to exist. It was not an earthquake. It was a physical displacement, as if the mountain itself had been struck by a god. Men and equipment were thrown across the room. The sound was not a noise. It was a physical blow, a pressure wave that ruptured eardrums and hammered the air from lungs. It was the sound of the planet's crust being used as a tuning fork, a gong, and a cannon all at once. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Silence. A silence more profound, more absolute than any the station had ever known before. The hum of machinery was gone. The alarms were gone. The vibration was gone. There was only the darkness, the smell of ozone and hot metal, and the sound of ragged, terrified breathing. A full minute passed. It felt like a lifetime. Then, with a flicker and a hum, the emergency backup generators, a tertiary system that hadn't been activated in years, kicked in. The harsh yellow maintenance lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows across the wrecked command center. The crew slowly picked themselves up, groaning, dazed. Minor injuries were everywhere, but they were alive. The station, though battered, was intact. The mountain had not collapsed. Alara was still in her chair, her hands resting on her dark keyboard. She had braced herself for the impact, her body rooted to the floor. She was looking at her screens, waiting for them to reboot. Jaskowski stumbled back to his post, his arm hanging at an odd angle. He brought up the main sensor display on a backup monitor. His eyes widened. The signal is gone," He stammered in disbelief. All of it. There's nothing. Just background noise. The baseline. Davies, leaning against his panel for support, let out a shaky laugh. Holy, she did it. She actually did it. Every eye in the room turned to Alara. They looked at her not as a scientist, not as a civilian, but as something else entirely. She was the calm at the center of the hurricane, the quiet mind that had stared into the abyss and forced it to blink. In that moment, she was not just their savior, she was their commander, in a way Thorn had never been. And it was into that awed silence that a new sound intruded, a crackle of static from the long-range communications array, a system that had been completely jammed for the past hour. The static cleared, and a voice, crisp, authoritative, and utterly calm, filled the room. Cerberus Deep, this is Fleet Command, Admiral Quinn speaking. Report status over. Thorn, who had been huddled against a bulkhead, saw his chance. This was a voice he understood. This was the hierarchy reasserting itself. He pushed himself to his feet, trying to regain some semblance of his former authority. Admiral Quinn, this is Commander Thorn. The station is... We've sustained heavy damage. We were attacked by an unknown hostile force. The Admiral's voice cut him off, cold as deep space. I am aware of your situation, Commander. We monitored the entire event on satellite gravimetry, a remarkable energy signature. My question was not for you. Is Operator Echo on station and operational? Over. A confused silence fell over the room. Thorn looked around, bewildered. Operator Echo? Admiral, there is no one by that designation here. The Admiral's voice took on a dangerous edge. Commander, I have Dr. Alara Vance's deployment orders on my desk. Her operational call sign is Echo. Now, for the last time, is she operational? The revelation hit the room like a second shockwave. Every head swiveled back to the small, quiet woman in the alcove. Dr. Alara Vance. Operator Echo. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her impossible calm, her preternatural understanding of the attack, her escape from the locked room, the way she had taken command. She wasn't a geologist. She was a ghost. A Tier 1 asset from a unit so secret most admirals didn't even know it existed. A unit that specialized in the impossible. Thorn's face went from ashen to chalk white. He looked at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time. He hadn't just insulted a civilian contractor. He had obstructed, imprisoned, and actively tried to sideline one of the military's most valuable strategic assets during a Tier 1 crisis. He was not just going to be relieved of command. His career was over. His life as he knew it was over. Alara reached over and keyed the comms panel at her station. This is Echo, she said, her voice clear and steady. I am operational. The threat has been neutralized. The source of the transmission was located at coordinates I am now uploading to your network. The feedback pulse should have fused their emitter array. Suggest you send a recovery team to pick up the pieces. Over. There was a pause on the other end, and then the Admiral's voice returned, all traces of harshness gone, replaced with a profound respect. Understood, Echo. Well done. We read you loud and clear. Your analysis was correct. There was another pause. I also have a full transcript of the station's internal comms and security logs from the last 3 hours. Commander Thorn. Thorn flinched as if struck. You are hereby relieved of command, effective immediately, the Admiral stated, his voice a blade of ice. Lieutenant Jaskowski, you are in temporary command. Your first order is to confine former Commander Thorn to his quarters under guard. He will not speak to anyone. He will not touch any station systems. A tribunal will be convened upon your return to Pearl. Is that clear?" "Yes, Admiral," Jaskowski said, his voice shaking slightly as he looked at the utterly broken man who had been his commander moments before. "Good. Echo, the station is yours. Your authority is absolute. Re-establish operational stability and await further instructions. Quinn out." The channel went silent. The new hierarchy had been established. It was not based on rank or seniority, but on the cold, hard fact of competence. Thorne stood for a long moment, a statue of disgrace, before two crewmen, their faces grim, approached and silently escorted him from the room. He didn't resist. Alara showed no sign of triumph, no hint of satisfaction. The Admiral's words, her vindication, the fall of her antagonist, it was all just data to her. The problem had been solved. The system had been corrected. She turned back to her terminal, which was slowly coming back online. There were aftershocks to analyze, damage reports to collate, and a detailed report to write on a new form of warfare. Her work was not done. The rest of the crew watched her for a moment, a silent, collective awe holding them in place. Then, guided by Jaskowski, they began the slow, arduous process of putting their world back together. They moved with a new quietness, a new purpose. The bluster and noise of Thorne's command had been replaced by the quiet, efficient focus of their new, unofficial leader. An hour later, as a semblance of order began to return, Petty Officer Davies approached her alcove. He moved quietly, respectfully. He held out a steaming mug. Coffee. He placed it silently on the edge of her console, next to a stack of geological charts. She didn't look up, but she gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Davies didn't leave. He stood there for a moment, watching the complex data flow across her screen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Yes, Davies?" The phase shifted harmonic, he said, the question having burned in his mind for the past hour. Was that a function of the granite's density, or the crystalline structure of the quartz inclusions? Alara paused her work. She turned her head slightly and looked at him. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. It was the first real expression anyone had seen from her. It was not a smile of warmth, but of recognition. He wasn't thanking her. He wasn't praising her. He was trying to understand. It was the highest form of respect he could offer. "The inclusions," she said. They acted as a secondary resonator, creating a chaotic but predictable interference pattern. The density of the granite only affected the propagation speed. She turned back to her screen, the moment of connection over. "Get some rest, Petty Officer. We have a lot of work to do." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and walked away. A new lesson learned. It was not about the shouting, or the rank, or the uniform. It was about seeing the patterns others missed. It was about understanding the machine, right down to the bedrock it was built on. She remained there for hours, a solitary figure bathed in the glow of her screens, a ghost in the machine who had tamed the storm. She had arrived in silence, a mystery cloaked in the guise of a scientist. She had faced down ignorance and ego, weathered a storm that broke lesser men, and wielded the planet itself as a weapon. When the station was stable and her report was filed, she would leave just as quietly, her purpose fulfilled, disappearing back into the shadows from whence she came. Cerberus Deep would be her secret. Another impossible victory in a war no one knew was being fought, leaving behind nothing but a humbled crew, a disgraced commander, and a legend whispered in the deep, dark places of the world. A story of the quiet woman who listened to the rock, and when the earth screamed, she was the only one who knew how to scream back.